Well, asset tracing generally refers to the legal process of identifying and locating misappropriated assets. Asset recovery is what generally follows and what can be understood as the process of returning those assets to their legitimate claimants. And while we primarily talk about asset tracing and recovery in the context of the organized crime, money laundering, corruption, etc., it's becoming more and more important both in the context of insolvency proceedings and in the context of enforcing arbitral awards. Because ultimately, when you think of it, being a recognized creditor in the insolvency proceedings or having an arbitral award in your favor is worthless unless you can actually go and seize respondents' assets and get the reimbursement that you're entitled to. As a legal issue, asset tracing and recovery have a number of fascinating legal problems to cope with. Among them, there is an issue of the availability of injunctive relief and its enforcement in different jurisdictions. Here, we're talking about asset freezing, we're talking about disclosure orders, gag and seal orders. Another question is the fact that assets are usually held in very complex corporate structures, which are used precisely to either conceal or dissipate assets. Or, for example, assets are held in the jurisdictions that do not require the disclosure of the ultimate beneficial ownership, which makes this process much more complicated. Again, another interesting issue these days is first the enforcement of certain measures and the accountability of third parties. Here we often talk about the banks, for example, or enforcement against the novel kinds of assets that are not yet clearly regulated in the legal field, as for example, cryptocurrency. I think that overall, and especially given what's been happening, it will be more and more important and discussed because as of now, there is no uniform regulation or no transnational regulation as such of asset tracing and recovery outside of the criminal proceedings context. So as of now, the only uniform regulation exists for the conviction-based asset tracing and recovery. At the same time, it's becoming more and more important in other areas of law, in other fields. Especially now, given the pandemic, many companies face difficult times with how to stay afloat, how to survive, how to keep operating, which might lead to more abuses, to more incentives for fraud, and for similar actions and offenses that are not necessarily criminally punishable under any given legal system. And when it comes to the civil asset tracing and recovery, there is very little regulation, especially on the transnational level. Given this, it will be difficult to pursue those claims. And given this, such regulation is very much needed. And in fact, in 2019, Ancetral started working on developing a uniform system for civil asset tracing and recovery, following the proposal of the US to develop such a set of regulation. And as of now, this work is mostly conducted in terms of the insolvency proceedings and insolvency laws, but with the potential to expand that same regulation to tax measures, to divorces, to enforcement of judgments and arbitral awards in other jurisdictions, which signifies that this is an area that needs regulation and which signifies that this is an area that's becoming more and more important. In this respect, it's very interesting. We shall see how the pandemic and the drastic change in the way the businesses operate these days will either push back or accelerate this process.